You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about positive solutions to environmental challenges. Solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe? How to plant a food forest? Restorative design or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned for Sustainable World Radio. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier. My guest today is Irina Stoenescu, a food researcher and consultant. Irina specializes in nutrition, healthy food, and trade issues, and she focuses on educating about the revival of food traditions, balanced nutrition, and sustainable food systems. And Irina is currently working on a project to introduce Eurasian specialty foods to a larger audience. Welcome to Sustainable World again, Irina.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be a guest of your show and to share some of my work with you.
Today we'll be talking about the rediscovery and discovery of food traditions. And Irina, one of the topics we want to talk about is millennials' influence on this rediscovery.
Let me first start with a definition of millennials. Maybe some of our listeners aren't necessarily familiarized with the term. I know I wasn't until about 2 years ago. And that's funny because that's my generation. That's my own generation. We would say people up to 35 years of age.
Dang, I missed it. No.
I'm barely making it.
Oh, and we'll also, for those non-millennial listeners right now, we will be discussing broader issues as well.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
When you're talking about the rediscovery of food traditions, can you give us an example of that? And then we'll just dive right into this topic.
Absolutely. Well, look at quinoa. Look at what has happened with quinoa. If you were to look at it in the 80s, you would have said it was a very marginal food in the US. It was consumed by a very small group of people. And gradually, you can now find it, I think, even in Walmart. It became a very popular food, thanks to its nutritional benefit, but also people were fascinated by its story. They were fascinated by the growers of it in the Andes. They were fascinated by the fact that it was an ancient Inca plant, that it was a non-gluten food. And little by little, it came to be a very popular food.
Why do you think that millennials in particular, and many other non-millennials I know, why do you think there is this current interest in reviving food traditions?
Well, I think it's a search for identity, and I think it's a search for community. In fact, I was reading an article recently titled "Food is Community for Millennials," and I think it's a good distillation. They're interested in rediscovering who they are, and they're interested in discovering the world. It's a cultural experience. Food is a cultural experience. I believe this is very logical in the context of us talking all the time about global issues, but at the same time we're talking about local culture.
So really we're talking about food stories and community with food. Can you talk a bit about that? Why do you think the story of food is so important right now?
Because I think that people are becoming increasingly more interested with contributing to a sustainable food system, to improving their health, but also about eating foods that they can feel good about. They want to know what their food is, as much as on a functional level, what is it going to do for their health, as much as what is it going to do for the community that's raising that. It's an ethical consideration that is being added to food.
Mm-hmm. Which for years, I mean, when I was growing up and eating all those delicious TV dinners and what Vienna sausages in a can and it's some healthy food. Sorry, Mom, but a lot of that processed food. The story was never even. I mean, it was Chicken of the Sea, the tuna, Charlie tuna swimming. That was about the only food story we had.
But I think Yes, I think you're right. I think we went through an era of standardization where there was a greater value being put in knowing what to expect. It's going to taste the same and you're going to know it, and it doesn't come from a specific place. And gradually, we are moving toward a localization, quote unquote, of food, if you will. People are very, very interested in understanding the source of their food.
And it's a localization, and yet it's also a globalization of bringing in foods from different areas.
Correct. And I think this is what empowers, in a way, our desire to have foods with a story. It's the quick communication and it's the betterment of transportation and trade in some of these things.
And do you think this is a natural, what would it be, succession or a natural a natural transition from the dulling of our taste buds, at least in the United States with all the fast food and the food we were just talking about? Do you think this is a transition from that? It's like the pendulum swing to wanting to know the story of the food and eating food that really tastes good.
I really think it's a natural transition caused by two main factors. I think it's the health crisis on one end. People want to eat better quality food. And it's the identity crisis at the other end. People want to have something that matters that they are putting on their plate. In terms of, is it a natural transition? Yes. And I don't think we've made that swing fully. Even if you're looking at the young generation, I was reading a poll, 60% of them are still visiting fast foods from time to time. So you could say that they're coexisting right now, that standardized meal with the more exotic, more traceable part of it.
So this would explain this desire for community, the ethical consideration when we're choosing foods now, why chefs, cooking schools, cooking classes online, it's all so popular at this time.
It's very popular. And if you look at how many chefs are becoming role models today, even when I was growing up, yes, we had chefs that we knew we wanted to go to the restaurant and eat there because the food was really good, but you couldn't say that they were as popular as they are today. And I think that they are the force, they're part of the force driving this change worldwide. If you look at some of the best restaurants in the world, are you familiar with Noma?
No.
Noma, for years, was considered the best restaurant in the world according to San Pellegrino classification. It's in Denmark. It was very, very special because the chef that runs Noma, his name is René Redzepi, put together a menu based exclusively on Scandinavian foods. Now, typically, when people think of Scandinavia, they think of a cold climate with relatively little to offer. So he decided that he didn't want to approach high cuisine by imitating French recipes or Italian recipes. He wanted to do something that was fit within the climate he was in and within the culture he was functioning in. So he decided to come with this menu that was completely new at the time. People were not familiarized with those ingredients necessarily, and he went to number one. So a lot of people have taken him as a guru of local foods.
Mm-hmm.
At the other end, people are looking to reinterpret what food really is. Another very famous chef is Ferran Adria, who opened El Bulli restaurant in Spain, and he is also the creator of molecular cuisine. Now, molecular cuisine can seem a little bit like a pretentious term. It is really an invitation for us to rethink what we know about how food should look like and what it should taste like. He's famous for taking solids and transforming them into liquids or gelatines. So you're looking at a carrot that's like a foam, and you wouldn't expect that on your plate at all. It's a taste sensation. So it's an invitation to reconsider standards and cliches. And El Bulli now is doing something interesting. He's founding El Bulli Foundation. It's already started. It's in the process. And he came with the idea of doing a Bullipedia, of course, inspired by Wikipedia. And this is supposed to be a collection of knowledge from all around the world, tracing the origin of the plants that we today consume, studying their wild relative, looking at their lineage. So he's looking at inspiration now from much beyond Spain. He's doing a global project.
Wow, that sounds so interesting.
And speaking of Noma, the other restaurant that I told you about, the Scandinavian cuisine, what is interesting is that now René Redzepi, the chef who's running it, is completely closing his restaurant in Denmark, although it is still number one. And he's transitioning to Australia. He's now been looking at Australian foods, and he's opening a new restaurant starting 2016 based on foods there. So I find it quite interesting. It's a constant pressure on these chefs to remain creative.
They're getting so much press now. I could see that the pressure is on not only to cook, but also to be in the forefront.
Oh, absolutely. Speaking of creativity, just as a fun fact, Ferran Adria, the chef from Bulli, was receiving somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 euro for a talk on creativity. I was that for a source of income.
Oh my goodness. Well, there you go, chefs. Any aspiring chefs out there? So, Irina, if you could talk a bit about how chefs and cooks and chefs are really impacting popular culture, can you share with us a bit about some of the things they're doing? You've already shared some, and just tell us more about this. It's really interesting.
Well, one aspect that fascinates me is how does this creativity that we're seeing at the first year of chefs trickles down to the general public. The two names that I gave you, okay, they're icons of the culinary world right now. Their restaurants are extremely exclusive and price prohibitive, so you might wonder why I even came up with that. Well, they are the pioneers. They are the people that we look at for inspiration. But what I've noticed is that people look at them and they emulate what they do. So quickly we see second-tier chefs trying to take some of those ingredients and work with them. And then we see them in quote-unquote health food stores, so that then in the latter phase of this process, you can see it at the lower price range type of food store. It really does have a trickle-down effect. We look at them for inspiration. For a while, it is a very exclusive recipe or product, but little by little, it does enter our life, the life of the commoners, of us commoners.
It's so true. Like you were saying, quinoa and these certain foods that before were just specialty foods.
They were specialty foods. And another thing that I find very interesting with the destiny of quinoa is it went from being a royal food for the Incas to being poor people's food after the conquest, after the arrival of the colonists. And again, it went to being a high status food, especially in the US, because it was fairly expensive. And now it's becoming more of a popular food. So I find interesting that alternation of it being rich people, poor people food.
Mm-hmm. And it keeps going back and forth.
A little bit, yes. I was speaking, I had the pleasure of being at the International Symposium on the Quinoa, which was organized in Pullman, Washington about 3 years ago. And I was speaking to one of the major importers of quinoa into the United States. He's of Bolivian descent, and he was telling me that growing up, his father didn't eat quinoa. They weren't eating it at their daily meals because it wasn't considered an urban food. What was so funny to him is that now he's selling it as a luxury food. It has changed perceptions in the United States, but it has also changed perception in many of the countries of origin, in the Andean countries, in Bolivia, Ecuador. They're now looking at it differently. It's already it's an aspirational food.
I read a story a couple of years ago about how many Bolivians now can't afford quinoa. Do you know anything about that, where it's become such an item in the States?
Yes, and I've heard this from various people. I can only tell you what I've been recounted, and I actually spoke to a group of Bolivian farmers who were part of the same conference that I was mentioning to you earlier. What they told me is that they've set their community in such a way that they keep a certain percentage for their own consumption every year. They are self-imposing that rule just so that they can eat it. I think the misperception comes from the fact that the prices have gone up because they are exporting it. the prices on the general market, but the farmers who are raising it, of course, are still consuming it. And also, I think that we are going to see a drop in prices on quinoa at world level because there are many other countries who are becoming more and more interested in cultivating it. At the same conference, I've heard people from the United States and Canada and Australia trying to plant large tracts of land with quinoa. Are prices high for the Bolivian consumer? Yes. Are the Bolivian farmers prohibited from consuming their own product? No. And one of the other things that was fascinating about the farmers I was speaking to is they said that their life has been transformed by this surge in interest for quinoa. So they now have a lot more disposable income. And one of the things that they've decided is that they were not going to use that for what is perceived as material development necessarily, but for a fulfilling life. That is how I would translate that from Spanish to English. They wanted to use their newly acquired income to attain a fulfilling life. So they were building some things, they were building schools, they were improving their sanitation, but at the same time, they weren't focused on earning huge amounts of money just to have money. They were regarding that in a very unique way.
So it's actually had a beneficial impact.
At least in that particular community that I came in contact with, yes.
And that really brings me to that idea of, does becoming such a popular superfood or like in style food, I know quinoa, I get, because I was eating quinoa for years and years and years, and people are like, what is that word? Quinoa? What the heck is it? And now it's just so popular. And does that strengthen food traditions, or can that have a negative impact on food traditions when something really reaches peak popularity?
Well, I think it has a positive impact on food traditions just by the fact that being completely new, you would have to look at how you cook it, right? You don't go to the store and just put it on your plate raw. So you have to look at how the Bolivians are using it, or yes. So to answer your question about whether or not it has a positive impact on tradition, I think that when you are introduced to a new food, you automatically look at the culinary traditions that accompany it. You are not that familiar with how you cook it. So, at least from that perspective, when you look at the culinary traditions, most people would feel inclined to also look at the history of the country, to look at the group that has been raising it for a lot of years. So, yes, I think it's expanding our knowledge of the world. I think it's a more positive than it is negative impact.
Irina, do you think this would have been possible without the connectedness of the internet? Do you think this revival of food traditions would be possible without the internet?
To a much lesser extent, in my opinion. I think that today we are seeing a fascination with posting pictures. Everybody has Instagram and Pinterest and Facebook, and they're all full of photos of different recipes of what we eat, where we dine out, what countries we're visiting. I think that's definitely facilitating our ability to gain information of other cultures and specifically of other food traditions. I believe that it's speeding the process. I don't want to say that it would not be possible without the internet, because people have been exchanging tradition for the longest time. If you think of what we now consider part of the Italian typical meal, think of the tomato, or think of corn, think of polenta. Obviously, they took that from somewhere else. They took it from South America, and they adapted it to their own cuisine, making it part of their tradition. I put that in quotes. So this borrowing of one plant or of one type of food from one part of the world to another has always occurred. I think that what is new is the speed and the extent at which we are able to do that today.
So what other impact, what other influence are millennials having on this whole revival of food traditions?
I think one of the aspects that is interesting to consider is that they are looking for authenticity. Now, when we talk about their interest in stories and their interest in understanding what ethical impact it has on the community and so on, I think it's easy to derive that they are not able to really control that they're being told the story and they could be naive to a certain extent. But that's not true. We were talking about how influential it is that they are now communicating rapidly and they are accessing the internet and they're posting all these pictures. It's very hard to trick the younger generations anymore. They share information, they share pictures, and they're keen on choosing what is authentic. They're keen on choosing the producer for the real value that they're putting into that food that they're recommending to them. So I believe authenticity is one of the key words of this generation, and the reason we are able to monitor for that is exactly the internet.
And it really, I would assume this has a major impact on food companies.
Oh, yes, they do. They know that they cannot do what they used to call greenwashing, quote unquote. They can't just come up with something that is superficial with a minor transformation and hype it up. It's much harder to do today than it would have been prior to the Facebooks and Twitters. And I think that's a positive impact on all of us.
It's accountability.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think companies are well aware of that. This is why you see a lot of them now being genuinely interested in coming up with products that are presented very, very objectively. Yes, absolutely. In publicity, everybody tries to convince you that that is the best. But I think that because of that increased accountability, they're much more careful with the kinds of claims that they make. If you look even at commercials, they're a little bit more ironic. I think that they're ironic, but they're very factual. And it's influencing other domains as well. I was in Connecticut last year at a tourism conference, and one of the speakers said that the number one driver now for tourism is what people perceive as being green, and that it goes much beyond the carbon footprint. Now they're interested in what they're going to do for that community. They're interested in what kind of food they're going to eat. Is it a local food? Is it organic? I believe that we're seeing a complete transformation taking place. That's not just about food. It really is about ethics, and it is about caring in a global sense. Truly, we're giving that caring in a global sense a tangible aspect.
And Irina, do you think that this is happening worldwide, rediscovery of food traditions?
Oh, absolutely. I just took a trip to my native country, to Romania, and believe me, I saw plenty of quinoa products being sold. Yes, definitely, it is a worldwide transformation. I was turning on the television one evening and switching channels, and I think that 4 out of 10 shows were about cooking. I certainly believe it is a worldwide tendency, and it's due to the faster communication. It's due to the internet. It's due to people having a thirst for sharing part of their identity, who they are. I think that it's a mistake to believe that people want globalization and want to think of themselves as an amorphous mass. I think if we can think of globalization as the ability to exchange information and goods at a more with a more efficient mechanism and at a greater speed, I think that that's something that would be much more acceptable to people.
We are witnessing this food tradition revival. And one thing that struck me about this was that we have the popularity of food, food traditions, cooking, also with the apparent detachment that many of us have from nature right now. Do you think that the whole food tradition revival can be a lifeline to connecting people more with nature? Or can you talk about that?
Yes, I do.
Disconnect.
Yes, I do. In fact, I'm think I was pointing to that contradiction earlier in our discussion. The younger generations are perceived as being remote from nature and really not knowing where their food comes from. I think that everybody is quite familiar with the polls where children said that yogurt grows on trees. Uh, so, yes, there is that. But at the same time, I think that we are witnessing a greater interest in learning where the food comes from and learning about cooking itself. For one, cooking tends to be now more gender neutral. If we're referring to millennials, I was reading this article according to which 61% of females and 60% of males in that particular generation now like to cook.
Wow.
They declare that they enjoy cooking. Now, backtrack, think 30, 40 years ago. How many males would have told you that they like to cook? So that's one part of it. It's much more uniform. And the other thing is that they are actually more inclined to learn about cooking than older generations. So yes, I think that there is going to be a reconnect with nature. Again, a gradual process. It's not going to happen overnight, but you do see people interested in cooking, and you do see a lot more people interested in understanding if we have good ingredients, quote unquote, if the foods have been processed, if it's organic or it's not, if it has been ethically raised. So all of these notions, I think, are driving a better understanding of where food comes from.
How else are the millennials fueling this interest in food, reviving food traditions?
Oh, I think that they're voting on it with their pockets. Although they are not known as a wealthy group, and many of them still depend on their parents. Remember, they're up to 35 years of age. Many of them still depend to some extent financially on their parents. A study conducted by the Boston Consulting Group concluded that they are more willing to spend their money on food than they are on electronics and clothes and beauty accessories, which have traditionally, been seen as the greatest and the most inviting kinds of categories of things that you would invest your income in. And I find this to be very interesting. Also, independent of how much money they make, they seem to maintain their high interest in dining out and trying new sensations, new tastes, new foods, new preparation methods. So I think they're, again, independent of their revenue, I think that you see an interest in understanding more about food and in trialing new dishes.
That sounds, I think millennials, I think your priorities are right. Food is so important.
It is so important when you think it's something you do 3 times a day.
I love that study because I've been that way pretty much my whole life, but I've had many people say, why do you spend more on food? What is the point? And I think now it's more accepted to do that.
Right, it's more accepted. I don't think it was completely outside of people's preoccupation to do that, but there was also a lack of information about what constitutes good food. You were talking about the fast food era. I don't think people were preoccupied with that. I don't think that they allocated value to eating very healthy foods. And also there was maybe a negative stigma when you talk about ethnic foods, you talk about a group food. Or you used to talk about it as something that was foreign to you. It wasn't inviting enough. I think it was a very small group of those who were more daring about trialing these new things.
So true. And now it's more discovery and sharing, and people are much more open. So, Irina, tell us a bit about the cross-cultural exchange of foods. What are some examples of localized foods to a particular group or culture going global?
Well, let's think of arugula or rucola. I was laughing the other day. I was reading this article from 2002, published by Purdue, by the university. And they were referring to rucola as being one of the new promising crops. Now, if you go today in the stores, everybody knows what arugula is or rucola is. It used to be a very niche product that you would find in Italian restaurants and in Italian neighborhoods. But now it's everywhere. everybody consumes it. We talked about quinoa. It's one of those other things. Most people today know what quinoa is. They may use it or not, but they know what it is. Think of coconut oil just a few years back, and now it is absolutely everywhere. So I think that with many of these foods, you can see a transition from them being quote unquote group foods or ethnic foods to being health foods and then to being popular foods.
Irina, when you were talking, we were talking about certain foods that have really gained in popularity. One that you mentioned was arugula, and I just know it grows like a weed. Can you tell us a bit about that?
It grows like a weed. It's native to the Mediterranean region, and it was always used in that area as a salad vegetable. Now, what is interesting to me about that is that in terms of palatability, a lot of people wouldn't feel so inclined. It has a certain bitter note, if you've noticed. But what I do find fascinating about that is its story. It was considered an aphrodisiac, and for that reason, it rose and fell in popularity. And it
No
was
pun intended. No, go ahead.
no, absolutely not. I didn't even notice until you told me. But it was, for example, forbidden to grow it in monasteries during the Middle Ages, and it was forbidden in times of war. So I think that a lot of these things that we see surging in popularity are doing so because of their taste, because of their nutrition, but also because of their stories. People like to hear the story. I mentioned to you I work as a consultant. One of the things that I always advise my partners is to tell the story. It is as important as the nutrition is on a new food. People are fascinated with finding out more about how that plant was raised, how it was consumed, what kind of intrigue was built around it.
So arugula has a very interesting story. Are there any other food stories you want to share with listeners today?
Well, yes, and I would like us to go a little bit more in the direction of what I'm doing right now, because there's one particular plant that has me in awe. I mentioned to you that I am working with the Armenian community. In particular, I'm working with Ruben McCurchin from Isabel Green Farm to introduce some Eurasian foods to the larger audiences in the US. I say to a larger audience because they are present and they are consumed in the Armenian community to some extent, but you are not able to find them easily in other stores outside of the Armenian community. One of the plants that I'm in awe with, as I was telling you, is sea buckthorn, Hypophyremnoides by its scientific name. Are you familiar with it?
You know, I'm familiar with the oil of it, but not the actual. Is it a fruit?
Yes, it
Berry?
is a fruit. It's a small berry. It grows on a bush, and it's a very spiny bush. Partially, this is why it's difficult to have it on the market because it's expensive. It's difficult to harvest it. As a funny thing, in Romania, one of the common names is devilish, and that's the reason they call it devilish because of its very brutal thorns. Um, and out of this berry, in Armenia, as well as in other countries in that region, they make juice and they make preserves. It's a little bit astringent if you were to taste it by itself, but in combination with honey or sugar, it is absolutely delicious. And in fact, it was studied for the longest time. To focus on the European space for a little bit, the ancient Greeks were feeding it to racehorses. You mentioned the oil. The oil makes your skin very good and it makes your hair very shiny. So they were giving it to racehorses to make them look good. But they also knew of their medicinal properties and they were mentioning it in different treaties for medicinal qualities. They were giving it in Tibet, they were giving it to mountain dwellers because it allowed their bodies, it's a tonic, it allowed their bodies to be coping with the conditions with the altitude easier. And they also discovered much later on that it has a positive effect on people going into space. The Russians were using it in their space program. They were feeding it to cosmonauts, which are the Russian equivalents of the American astronauts, because they discovered that it protected them from radiation, from cosmic radiation.
Oh, wow.
So I don't even know where to start telling you about this plant. One of the things that has me puzzled is that it grows in extremely difficult climates, and it takes temperatures from -40 to 104 Fahrenheit.
It's very adaptable,
Yeah, it's
to put it
bulletproof.
mildly.
How much better than that can you get? It's also very productive. I know in China they planted huge amounts of land with it, and they are using it for food as well as medicinally. I was reading about another case, speaking of the oil that you mentioned. In Romania, there was an accident in the 80s at a chemical plant, and 4 of the workers had extremely severe burns, 3rd and 4th degree burns, and their lives were considered to be in danger. And by conventional medicine, there was not much that they could do to them. So they flew in one of the professors that was studying sea buckthorn, and they applied oil on their wounds. They also made them ingest that oil, and it's not only that they are still living today, and their burns healed in almost a miraculous way, but also their internal lesions seemed to disappear. So yes, I'm completely fascinated with this plant.
What a useful plant.
Yes, it is, and also nutritionally, it is extremely interesting. It's a very high in antioxidants, high in vitamin C content, vitamins B1, B2. It's high in beta carotenoids, flavonoids, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium. So it's really a vitamin concentrated little berry.
Sea buckthorn sounds resilient and just full of vitamins and nutrients. Is there anything else you want to add about this amazing plant?
Well, I think I just teased you with it. And when we're ready to put it on the market, I hope that we can meet again via Skype, and I'll give you more details on what we're bringing in.
That sounds fabulous. And maybe you can be a guest on the Plant Report. Every Plant Has a Story, my other podcast.
I would love to.
We can dive deep into the sea buckthorn. That sounds great. And I know there was another plant you mentioned in our email correspondence, which was, I think, is it Cornelian Cherry?
Yes, it's Cornelian Cherry. The scientific name is Cornus mass, and if you want to relate it to an American plant, it's a relative of American dogwood. Some people know it here for its ornamental potential. It's also a berry, the bush with a berry, so it's an attractive ornamental. It's been used traditionally by Armenians, by Greeks, by Romans and Persians, and it was very highly esteemed. It has an exotic taste. Now, I wouldn't know how to describe it, so I'd like to quote my friend William Wise Weaver, because I think his description is better than whatever I could give you. He says it's very complex. It's a mix of carnations, the Croatian cherry liquor Maraschino di Zadar, black cherries, and the touch of the fragrance of a night blooming cereus. So that doesn't make you want to taste it.
Fascinating. I want one.
It is extremely special in taste. I really don't have a good comparison to another berry. It's an exotic taste and also has an incredible perfume. So this is another one of the things that we would like to introduce the American public to, and we're thinking of preserves at this point. It's also very high in vitamin C, so another one of those boosts for your body, especially as we're going into the cold season. It can also be pickled. I am thinking that this is another product that would be much appreciated. You can pickle it almost like an olive.
And I've never heard of that plant.
As again, it's one of those that you would be able to find to a very limited extent in ethnic markets.
With your experience with food and food trends, if you had to forecast where you see the next inspiration of food traditions being revived, what would that be?
I think we are all seeing the interest in South American foods. I follow chefs, and I see that a lot of them are researching that area. I believe what I'm working on right now is certainly going to be of great interest because it's a zone of an extremely unique cultural mix. If we're talking about the Caucasian mountains, if we're talking about Eastern Europe, it's really the confluence of Eastern and Western civilizations. So I think that's another area that has a lot of potential. And then I also believe that we will see in America an increased interest in native foods, in Native American foods. And that's another surprise that I hope to share with you shortly. I am working on another project to promote the foods consumed by the Native Americans.
Well, I look forward to that. And is there anything else you want to say about the topic today of food? That we talked about amazing plants, reviving food traditions, and millennials' impact on this whole topic, on this whole issue.
That I hope that the trend of reviving cultural tradition continues and expands beyond the group of millennials. That I believe that a creativity in the cuisine will keep not just your intellectual pursuits happy, but it will also allow you to have a diversified diet and a better health. And I think that's what we are all aspiring to. We want to satisfy our souls and our bodies. We want to have foods that we are happy to consume because of how they're raised, because we like their stories, and because they enable us to keep our bodies healthy.
Well, thank you so much for joining me and talking about this interesting topic today. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you, Jill. As always, it's my pleasure. And I hope that we will meet again soon.
We will. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. You can find us online at sustainableworldradio.com and also on iTunes. For more information about permaculture and ecology, visit the Sustainable World Media YouTube channel, where you'll find videos about permaculture, aquaponics, organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, and much, much more. Sustainable World Radio is a listener-supported program. If you like what we do, please consider making a donation to the show. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier, and thank you so much for listening.